Good evening, it's Thursday, January 19th. Welcome to a new episode of System Update, our new live light nightly show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively here on Rumble, the free speech alternative to YouTube. Tonight we examine the question of some of the dreariest and most amoral tactics of defenders of woke ideology, particularly their penchant for casually accusing their opponents of bigotry, even when no animus toward any group is expressed by their critics, both as a means of destroying people's reputation who dissent from their orthodoxies, and more importantly, to suppress the ability to debate vital questions by ensuring that everyone knows that any questions of their prevailing orthodoxies can be subjected to these reputation-destroying tactics. But we will also use that framework to examine whether a similar dynamic is occurring among some factions on the right, not by accusing critics of police policy of being racist or skeptics of the excesses of Me Too of being misogynist, but instead by branding anyone who criticizes the government of Israel or U.S. support for that foreign country of being an anti-Semite. Just today, the dean of Harvard's Kennedy School admitted he, quote, erred when he rejected the fellowship that had been offered to the former executive director of Human Rights Watch, Kenneth Roth, due to his very tepid concerns about Roth's criticism of the action of the Israeli government. Now, we understand this is a sensitive topic for many people, to put that mildly, so we will ask you to keep an open mind about the arguments we present while providing our commitment to treat this topic in the same responsible manner we try to treat all topics, by comprehensively examining the relevant questions, not through assertions or tendentious interpretations, but through the evidence and facts and pertinent legal and constitutional issues. As always, as soon as we're done here with our 1 hour live show on Rumble, we will move to Locals for our interactive after show to take your questions and comment on your feedback. For now, welcome to a new episode of System Update, starting right now. Starting in the 1920s, the U.S. Supreme Court struggled to distinguish between pornography, which they had ruled was protected free speech under the First Amendment, from obscenity, which the court had ruled could be constitutionally criminalized because it fell outside of the scope of the First Amendment. After decades of attempting with great futility to offer coherent definitions of the two terms, an otherwise obscure Supreme Court justice named Potter Stewart uttered one of the court's most famous phrases. And in 1964 ruling in the case of Jacobellis versus Ohio, which overturned the criminal prosecution of a film producer after the Ohio Supreme Court had ruled that his film, entitled The Lovers, crossed the line from legal pornography into illegal obscenity, Justice Stewart agreed with that court decision, that he had done nothing illegal, but he wrote separately to admit what the court had refused to acknowledge for decades, namely that it is virtually impossible to offer a clear and consistent definition of obscenity. In his concurring opinion, the judge wrote, quote, under the First and 14th Amendments, criminal laws in this area are constitutionally limited to hardcore pornography. I shall not today attempt further to define the kinds of material I understand to be embraced within that shorthand definition, and perhaps I could never succeed in intelligently doing so. But I know it when I see it, and the motion picture involved in this case is not that. Now, over the last several years, but particularly beginning with the nationwide protests that erupted after the May 2020 police killing of George Floyd, there has been an explosion in the use of the phrase woke ideology or wokeness or just woke. Defenders of that ideology have often complained that its critics struggle to offer a definition of exactly what this ideology consists of. In November of 2021, CNN host Dana Bash asked Democratic Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, quote, are Democrats too woke, Senator? Warner's reply suggested that he believed Virginia's Republican governor, Glenn Youngkin, had won that election because he succeeded in exploiting fears among Virginia voters of the excesses of woke ideology. And while he did not specify what he meant exactly, he offered two examples, namely Democrats calling for defunding the police, a policy proposal Warner emphasized he vehemently opposed, and teaching school children critical race theory, which Warner claimed never actually happens, but nonetheless said people reasonably were led to fear that it did. Now, both Dana Bash's question and Senator Warner's answer enraged a staff writer at The Atlantic. one whom I think can be fairly described as woke, Adam Sewer. And in response to that CNN segment, Sewer, as adherents of woke ideology are prone to do, strongly implied that the term is one that only racists use to disguise their true sentiments. And he further complained, quote, "Part of the utility of this kind of woke is that it expresses sentiments the people using it would be uncomfortable articulating directly, which is why anyone getting a question like this should simply respond by asking them to explain what they mean." Now, at least regarding the definitional ambiguity of woke, I don't think Sewer is entirely wrong. The term woke is plagued by some vagueness and imprecision. But I believe that people recognize it not so much because there is a universally accepted and concrete definition of it, but more so in line with Potter Stewart's view of obscenity. Quote, "I know it when I see it." And I would suggest wokeness, even if it lacks a perfect definition, is indeed readily recognizable. And the reason that matters is because it describes an ideology and a set of political goals that are very consequential. One may even say radical. That is why the very independent writer Freddie DeBoer responded with his own anger to Adam Sewer's suggestion that woke means nothing. It is merely a useful term for espousing disguised acceptable bigotry. The reason for DeBoer's frustration was captured in the not entirely family-friendly headline of the article he wrote about Adam Sewer's reaction. Quote, "Please just fucking tell me what term I am allowed to use for the sweeping social and political changes you demand." Vulgar though that may be, I think it probably safely falls on the right side of Justice Stewart's line. And about the claim that one can't use the term woke to describe this new ideology because it's racist, DeBoer wrote the following, quote, "If you ask these people, are you part of a social revolution? They'll loudly tell you yes, yes they are. They're going to shake society at its very foundations. Well, okay then, what do I call your movement? You rejected every name that organically developed, so I'll use the one that you pick, but you have to actually pick one. You can't just bitch on Twitter every time someone tries to describe your political cohort, which again, you yourself say intends to change the world. Name yourself or you will be named." Now, as DeBoer noted, proponents of this movement readily acknowledge that they are demanding sweeping changes. And those changes are often expressly stated, things such as reparations or preferences for certain groups defined by their race or ethnicity, illustrated by the COVID relief programs we've been reporting on that gave priority to either Black Americans or other specific non-white groups, though not all, when it came time to dole out government assistance for the pandemic. Or new views about what children should be taught in schools about race and gender. Or defunding the police, either literally or metaphorically. Or empowering underage children to obtain what is now called trans-affirming care, that can range from being called a different name or identified with a different pronoun as young as 8 years old or even younger, to puberty-blocking medications for 10 to 12-year-olds, and hormonal treatments and even invasive surgeries for 16 and 17-year-olds, sometimes even 15-year-olds. It also entails punishing people for their refusal to comply with government orders about what they can do with their own bodies, such as whether they want to inject those experimental vaccines into themselves and their children. And it even entails radically revising history to change the long-standing date of the American founding, as the New York Times was showered with a Pulitzer Prize for doing, even over the objections of a broad range of historians. But beyond the specific policy goals that indicate the presence of wokeness, and perhaps even more important than those specific policy goals, wokeness is typically identifiable through a series of argumentative tactics, rhetorical approaches, and dissent-suppressing accusations. It is not just a common feature of woke activists, but I would suggest a defining feature that they have a very hair-trigger sensitivity to finding and hearing and seeing racism, misogyny, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, and other various bigotries hidden deep within their political adversaries, meaning anyone who opposes their political agenda, almost to the point that it is not hyperbole to say that advocates of woke ideology believe that the only reason a person might criticize them or oppose their policy aims is because those critics are driven by some or all of the smorgasbord of bigotries and prejudices. And this, I would say, is the most frequent criticism of wokeness, and it's one I share. That in order to demonize their opponents and to create a climate where nobody can safely question their views, they casually and publicly brand people as bigots, even though their critics have expressed no hostility or dislike of any kind for any specific group of people. So, for instance, someone who defends police actions or argues that we need more police, not less police, is instantly branded a white supremacist or an anti-black racist, even though they've expressed no animus of any kind to black people, and just by the way, in the case of policing, happen to be on the side of most black Americans, who overwhelmingly say they want the same amount of policing or even more police patrolling their neighborhoods. Or if one argues that, say, people are branded and vilified as sexual harassers or racists with insufficient evidence presented or due process provided, the excesses of the Me Too movement, they are instantly demonized as misogynists, even though they've expressed no hatred of any kind toward women, and those views are shared by a large number of women. Or if people question whether puberty blocking medications are safe to administer to prepubescent children, or question the fairness of allowing people who are born and pass through puberty as biological men to compete in professional sports with biological women, one is automatically called a hateful transphobe or even wanting trans people dead, even though no hatred or dislike toward trans people has been expressed, and many gay men and lesbians and even trans people themselves agree with those views. Now, we have on many occasions reported on these kinds of tactics and denounced them. And given how popular such critiques are among everyone other than pro-establishment liberal leftists, it would be very easy for me to continue to do so. It's an easy thing for me to offer my audience, since I know my audience, and I believe that most of them, most of you, likely concur with my assessment of woke ideology, and particularly the immoral tactics I just described, that not only unfairly seek to vilify people and try unjustly to destroy their reputations, but far worse, place vital societal and political debates off limits by making clear that unless you agree with their prevailing orthodoxy, they will try, and often succeed, in destroying your reputation. I have no doubt I will continue to report on the use of, by the liberal left, of these dreary and lowly tactics. But for tonight, I would like to ask you to consider whether parts of the American and Western right use the same tactic, not by calling unjustly or demonizing someone as racist for their views on policing, or smearing someone as misogynistic for their views on due process, or declaring someone transphobic for questioning the use of medication on children, but instead maligning people as anti-Semitic for either criticizing the government of a foreign country, Israel, or questioning whether the U.S. should continue to transfer billions and billions of dollars every year to strengthen that foreign country, even while citizens of Israel enjoy benefits like healthcare coverage and access to college that many American citizens themselves still do not share. Note that I'm not talking here about people who express hatred for Jewish people, of which I'm one, just by the way, but who take policy positions on Israel and the U.S.'s relationship with it that are said to be motivated by hidden or implicit or unstated, but somehow still self-evident animus toward Jewish people. And relatedly, the question we want to explore is this: has the tactic of casting critics of Israel or U.S. aid toward Israel resulted, either unintentionally or by design, in suppressing debate over these questions due to fear that the people who express dissent will be accused of being an anti-Semite? Still one of the most toxic and destructive accusations that can be attached to one's reputation, all due to their refusal to affirm the prevailing ideology on these questions. Now, I raise this because it's a self-evidently important question. For the same reason that it's vital not to allow baseless bigotry accusations to be used by the left to suppress debate and unjustly destroys people's reputation due to legitimate political dissent. But I also raise this because censorship of Israel critics in virtually every American institution now, media, academia, and even under the force of law, is one of the most common forms of the kinds of suppression of free speech that we on this show frequently cover and criticize. Just today, we have a brand new example of it that, while by no means the most blockbuster story ever, illustrates how pervasive is this tactic, precisely because it was wielded against someone who, if he can be called a critic of Israel at all, he's one of the most unyieldingly timid and respectful and deferential and mild in how he expresses those critiques, and yet he was denied an opportunity, a job opportunity, by one of the most powerful institutions in the country, Harvard, as a result of those criticisms. Here is an article in today's New York Times that reports on this story. It was several weeks ago that the former executive director of Human Rights Watch, Kenneth Roth, was offered a fellowship, only for the dean of Harvard's Kennedy School to reject it due to the dean's concerns that Ken Roth had in the past criticized Israel's human rights abuses the way, in the capacity of executive director of that group, he criticized almost every country on the planet's human rights abuses. And today, the New York Times reports that although it no longer matters, since Kenneth Roth got and accepted a position with the University of Pennsylvania, as you can see in the headline, quote, Harvard reverses course on human rights advocate who criticized Israel. The article reads, quote, the Harvard Kennedy School reversed course on Thursday and said it would offer a fellowship to a leading human rights advocate it had previously rejected after news of the decision touched off a public outcry over academic freedom, donor influence, and the boundaries of criticism of Israel. The controversy erupted earlier this month when The Nation published a lengthy article revealing that last summer, the school's dean, Douglas Elmendorf, had vetoed a proposal by the school's Carr Center for Human Rights Policy to offer a one-year fellowship to Kenneth Roth, the recently retired executive director of Human Rights Watch. At the time, Elmendorf told colleagues that he was concerned about perceptions that Human Rights Watch had a bias against Israel, according to two faculty members. Now, let me just stop here and remind you that we are not talking about elementary school teachers or middle school teachers, where I think one might be rightly concerned about what they intend to teach to one's children. We're talking here about a person who would not even be in a teaching position, but even if he were, he would be at one of the most influential academic institutions on the planet, Harvard, and speaking with and interacting with adults, people who are capable of hearing, quote, biased views. In fact, one of the reasons you go to college is to learn how to interact with and critically evaluate views with which you disagree. You read all kinds of things that contain all sorts of views and biases that modern society now condemns, or even ones that they support. Adults in college can handle disagreement. That's a major argument that comes from the right when faculty members and academic institutions try and censor conservative views or students on the grounds that they're racist or transphobic or misogynistic. And yet now here we have the same exact thing, but from the other side, namely that Harvard students and Harvard itself can't possibly be associated with somebody who criticizes Israel beyond the, quote, boundaries that have been imposed on this discourse. Boundaries imposed by whom? And why do those boundaries exist? Now, the article goes on, quote, the revelations prompted sharp rebukes from prominent free expression groups, a letter signed by more than 1,000 Harvard students, faculty, and alumni criticizing what it called, quote, a shameful decision to blacklist Kenneth Roth, and private complaints from faculty. Quote, penalizing people for criticizing Israel is hardly limited to me, he continued. What is the Kennedy School and Harvard more broadly going to do to show this episode conveys a renewed commitment to academic freedom rather than just exceptional treatment for one well-known individual? By which he means that as Kenneth Roth, he has a large platform. He was able to bang the table and be heard and embarrassed Harvard and cause them to reverse it. But what about students who are critics of Israel and get punished, as I'll show you that they routinely are on campuses around the country, or people who don't have similar public platforms? Quote, Roth had been recruited for the fellowship, which includes no teaching duties, by Matthias Reese, the director of the Carr Center. In an email to Carr Center students, faculty members, fellows, alumni, and others following the Nation article, Rice called him, quote, one of the most distinguished human rights leaders of our time, and said the following the fellowship rejection was, quote, one of the lowest moments of my professional life. In interviews and emails with the Times, Rees and another faculty member, Catherine Sicknick, said that Elmendorf, the dean, in explaining his rejection of Roth, had cited the perception that Human Rights Watch was, quote, biased against Israel. He told them he had become aware of the issue following discussions with unnamed people within the university, they say. Now, let me just stop and say here two things. Number one, as someone who is actually a critic of Israel for a long time, it's an issue that's important to me in part because my government is a major supporter of the Israeli government, which makes it, in my view, my responsibility to question and criticize or examine and scrutinize the countries that my government is playing such a major role in propping up, which is why I don't think it's my business how countries around the world that the United States is not involved in manage to conduct their own affairs, but I absolutely think it's the business of every American to ask what countries are we supporting and how, and that makes it our business. But also, as a Jew, someone in whose name Israel not only exists, but engages in a lot of this behavior, including behavior that I regard as violations of human rights, I also feel an extra responsibility to criticize it the way that I criticize my own government and other governments in order to do so. And I have to say, as someone who's done that for a long time, I've always regarded Kevin Roth as Kenneth Roth as incredibly pro-Israel. He's the head of a human rights organization that's supposed to denounce and monitor human rights abuses around the world. I personally regard the Israeli treatments of Palestinians in Gaza as a particularly abusive form of human rights abuse. These are millions of people barred from leaving their own country, trapped in an open-air prison. You can debate that all you want, but that's my view. And I've always seen Kenneth Roth as somebody who seems very reluctant to criticize Israel, except in the most careful and tepid way. He's an outspoken supporter of Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. His support for Israel goes back many decades. And when he criticizes Israel, it's almost like in a way that seems cursory. Like, of course, as the head of a human rights group, I have to criticize Israel and the U.S. occasionally, but 90% of his attacks, at least, are on enemies of the United States. He loves to criticize China and Iran and Russia, whoever the United States government condemns. That's easy to do, and that's most of what he does. When he ventures into criticizing the United States and Israel, it's very, very reluctant. It's very, very deferential and polite. And so if somebody as mild as he is disqualified from holding positions at places like Harvard, then the boundaries of the discourse are extremely narrow in a way that I don't think we want, no matter what our views are, the boundaries to be on any debate. That is what the woke warriors of American liberalism do. They try and constantly narrow the range of debate, and if you step 1 inch outside of it, you're guilty of bigotry. And I think this incident shows that one step outside or 1 inch outside what are considered legitimate criticisms of Israel, which are very, very few, will disqualify you and make you radioactive and even lose your job, as just happened to him. Now again, he'll be fine. He has a lot of friends all over the world because of how he used that group. But as he himself said, people with far less of a platform than he are very vulnerable to this sort of attack, suppression of free speech. And I'm about to show you that this is far from the only instance. There are countless ones taking place all over academia, which you probably think, oh, they're so far left academia is that it can't possibly happen there. Except, you're right, academia is extremely far to the left, except on this one question. It's happening within the Democratic Party, which you probably think, oh, they're full of Israel haters, when in reality, AIPAC's most loyal friends and the people whom they support the most are always at the leadership of the Democratic Party. There are no more outspoken defenders of Israel than people like Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and the new leader of the House Democrats, Hakeem Jeffries. So this is a very bipartisan, overwhelming consensus among institutions of power, including in generally liberal or left-wing ones like Harvard and other places of academia, but it is happening in academia. And I personally always view human free speech limitations or debate suppression in academic institutions as particularly threatening, because that is the one place in society that's supposed to be reserved for questioning everything. That's the place where we go to challenge all orthodoxies, where kind of anything goes. That's what academic freedom is for, to foster that kind of a climate. It's supposed to be unique in its tolerance for dissent, not cracking down on it with increasing levels of rigidity. So here, for example, is a news story from, or a different story from the Toronto Star. It is from September 17th, 2020. There you see the headline on the screen, quote, "Search for new director of the University of Toronto's Law Faculty's International Human Rights Program leads to resignations, allegations of interference." And here's what happened here, very similar, quote, "The Faculty Advisory Board of the International Human Rights Program, IHRP, at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Law has resigned following a controversy over the hiring of a new director for the program. Edward Iogabuchi, dean of the prestigious law school, has come under fire, accused of rescinding an offer of directorship to prominent international academic Valentina Azarova. Several national and international scholars wrote to the university to express their consternation that the reversal came after reports of pressure from a sitting judge, a major donor to the faculty. He reportedly expressed concerns in private over Azarova's past work on the issue of Israel's human rights abuses in Palestine. All the letters mentioned here have been seen by the Star." Now, again, leave aside your view on Israel and Palestine. Just like I ask people all the time to leave aside their own views when it comes to censorship. The question is, even if you're an ardent supporter of Israel, even if you believe everything they do is justified, even if you believe that it's a pure case of good and evil, and the Israelis are good and the Palestinians are evil, and everything the Israeli government does as a result is justifiable, even if that's something you believe, shouldn't you want there to be free and open debate in academic institutions on this very inflammatory question? The same thing I tell people when it comes to the war in Ukraine, where big tech has repeatedly censored people who question the NATO narrative and the US narrative on Ukraine. Even if you support the US proxy war in Ukraine, don't you want there to be free and open debate about whether that war is being understood correctly in the West? Aren't you still concerned that big tech and governments are uniting to suppress the right of your political opponents to be heard? So here we see from a Toronto Star article in May of 2021, confirmation that in fact this judge, a major donor, did in fact do what was suspected. Quote, the headline here, "Tax court judge committed a, quote, serious error in University of Toronto hiring fiasco. A judicial review finds, but it won't remove him." Quote, "The University of Washington has put its 5-year-old Israel studies program on hold after a major donor, angry about a professor's criticism of Israel, took her money back. Becky Bonronia, a prominent Seattle philanthropist, gave $5 million in 2016 to create the program. But after a professor who held the Jack and Rebecca Ben-Rona Endowed Chair in Israel Studies was among hundreds of Jewish students and Israeli studies professors to sign a widely circulated statement criticizing Israel last year, Ben-Rona became concerned about what was happening in the program she had funded. She requested months of meetings with the professor, Leora Helplin, and university officials to discuss her views on the program's direction. Those meetings, which also included a representative of the pro-Israel group Stand With Us, according to a person familiar with them, culminated in the university returning the entire endowment to Barania earlier this year. As a result, the university stripped Halprin of her chair position and halted programming related to Israel studies. Moves that Halprin told the JTA will have consequences both on campus and well beyond it. So here you see a separate controversy. It's actually, if we can put this up on the screen, that one took place at the University of Washington, where at the University of Toronto, that judge was found to have exerted undue pressure as a donor to get Israel critics fired from the faculty. The same thing here at the University of Washington, where donors wield a lot of influence. The argument at Harvard was that the reason Kenneth Ross was rejected was because donors had objected to his appointment as well. So whoever it is, maybe university faculty who are supporters of Israel, maybe major donors who are supportive of Israel, you're seeing over and over. We just showed you 3 major academic institutions where people are losing their jobs and being booted off faculty for criticizing a foreign country, the government of Israel, and not expressing animus towards Jews, not in any way expressing any anti-Semitism, but criticizing a foreign country, which increasingly one is not allowed to criticize if one wants to keep a job in academia. Now, Israel itself has been strengthening and fortifying these restrictions as well. Here's an article from May of 2010, so 13 years ago, in which the Jewish intellectual Noam Chomsky, whose family and whose parents were Hebrew school teachers, that's where he learned how to be a linguist, Noam Chomsky, who spent all of the 20th century defending the state of Israel. He viewed kibbutzes and the socialist movement inside Israel as holding major promise. And to this very day, Noam Chomsky is an opponent of the boycott and divestment movement of Israel, arguing that not only is it unrealistic, but it is designed to destroy the Jewish state, which can never happen. But he is a critic of the Israeli government, angering Palestinian activists and more radical critics of Israel for not supporting the boycott movement. And he tried to enter Israel, and here's what happened. According to the Guardian, and I remember this incident very well, he's a friend of mine, and I recall talking to him about it, quote, Noam Chomsky is barred by the Israelis from lecturing in Palestinian West Bank. And the article says, quote, Noam Chomsky, whose withering critiques of political establishments have earned him the wrath of regimes of all persuasions around the world, was told today he was forbidden by Israeli immigration officials from entering the Palestinian West Bank. Chomsky said he was disappointed and surprised to have been turned back from the Albany Bridge across the Jordan River, which is understood to be the first time he has been refused entry by the Israelis. He had been due to give a series of lectures on domestic and foreign policy at Birzeit University and the Institute for Palestine Studies in Ramallah in the West Bank. He told Al Jazeera television that the immigration official who interviewed him had made it clear that, quote, the government of Israel doesn't like the kinds of things I say, which puts them in the same category as every other government in the world. Now, that is not the first time anything like that ever happened either. Here is a separate Guardian article from 3 years earlier about a separate scholar, Norman Finkelstein, also a Jewish professor whose family perished in the Holocaust. And he was deported from Israel, and then, under the pressure of Alan Dershowitz, he was fired from the academic institution where he was employed, and his academic career never recovered. Here's what the Guardian article says, quote, Norman Finkelstein, the controversial Jewish-American academic and fierce critic of Israel, has been deported from the country and banned from the Jewish state for 10 years, it emerged Friday. Finkelstein, the son of a Holocaust survivor, who has accused Israel of using the genocidal Nazi campaign against Jews to justify its actions against the Palestinians, was detained by the Israeli security service, Shin Bet, when he landed at Tel Aviv's Ben Gurion airport on Friday. Finkelstein is one of several scholars rejected by Israel in the increasingly bitter divide in academic circles between those who support and those who criticize its treatment of Palestinians. Last year, Israel's most contentious, quote, new historian, Ilyan Papi, left his job as a senior lecturer in political science at the University of Haifa after he endorsed the international academic boycott of Israeli institutions, provoking the university president to call for his resignation. Finkelstein was also refused tenure last year at Chicago's DePaul University for attacking several staunch Israel supporters and academics, such as Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz. So you see first it emanating from Israel, a country that has always said it is necessary because it gives refuge to Jews around the world, and yet it wouldn't let Noam Chomsky, 100% American Jew, from entering the West Bank in order to give lectures, nor would it allow Norman Finkelstein to remain on its soil due to his criticisms of Israel. Now, if you want to say, look, that's Israel, we don't care what Israel does, that's fine, but as you see from that article, it has aggressively spread into American academic institutions where people are very vulnerable to being fired for essentially expressing criticisms of that foreign government, something that we expect to be permitted in every other country, but certainly in our own. Now, There's a new group of free speech activists and civil libertarians that I typically refer to as the new old ACLU, called FIRE, and they began primarily as an organization to fight what was then left-wing censorship aimed at right-wing students, but increasingly they become an all-purpose civil liberties and free speech defending group that I really respect for that reason. And one of the primary causes that they've taken up over the last 5 years, in addition to all sorts of left-wing censorship that they combat, is the refusal by Fordham University to allow a student group to exist whose purpose was to agitate for justice for Palestinians and their human rights, which they perceive, rightly or wrongly, as being abridged by the Israeli government. Here you see the article from FIRE, which conservatives universally respect, and they should. Quote, Fordham University, prospective students for justice in Palestine chapter rejected over their political beliefs. On November 17, 2016, the Fordham United Student Government approved Students for Justice in Palestine's application for recognition, noting that SJP, quote, fulfills a need for open discussion and demonstrates that Fordham is a place that exemplifies diversity of thought. Absolutely great. They approved their application on the grounds that we need debate. That's what colleges are for. But on December 22nd, the Dean of Students, Keith Eldridge, overruled the USG and said he would not grant this group official recognition, writing that he, quote, cannot support an organization whose sole purpose is advocating political goals of a specific group and against a specific country. Do you think that if a group wanted to form to agitate against Iran and the human rights abuses of that government, or to oppose the human rights abuses of Russia, that you would hear any college administrator denying the group's right to exist on the grounds that they shouldn't be criticizing only one? Of course not. And then he also went on to say, when denying this group's right to exist, quote, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict often leads to polarization rather than dialogue. Exactly. All the more reason to have universities host debates with free speech about it. In response to media attention, Fordham officials released a statement reaffirming Eldridge's decision, claiming, quote, the narrowness of Students for Justice in Palestine's political focus makes it more akin to a lobbying group than a student club. On January 25th, 2017, FIRE and the National Coalition Against Censorship wrote a letter to Fordham calling on the university to reverse its rejection of SJP and reaffirm the university's commitment to free speech for students. On January 27th, FIRE and NCAC wrote again to Fordham. A lengthy legal battle ensued, and in May of 2021, the student group lost. They upheld Fordham's right to ban this group. In a separate article, FIRE, under this headline, quote, Fordham should be ashamed. Bitter outcome for pro-Palestinian group after university's 4-year fight to censor. Quote, last week, the New York State Court of Appeals declined to hear the appeal of the student group, the student plaintiffs in Awad versus Fordham University, a case challenging Fordham's 2017 denial of recognition to a prospective chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine on account of the group's viewpoint. The decision from New York's highest court leaves in place a state appellate court December 2020 ruling in favor of the university. This is what FIRE says, quote, this outcome is a bitter setback for student expressive rights at private universities in New York. Any person or organization committed to freedom of expression on campus should be deeply disappointed and concerned by this result. Are you someone deeply disappointed and concerned by this result? The reason why I went through so many examples is to demonstrate to you that even if you want to say that the left engages in these tactics more, an argument with which I'm willing to agree, it is not the case that these are isolated or rare instances on the right of attacking free speech, not when it comes to what is taught to school children, but what is allowed to be heard at major academic institutions, taught by professors or advocated for by students, adult students. I want to also demonstrate to you that one of the major topics we cover on this show, and that I've covered in my reporting over the last 2 years, which is big tech censorship of primarily conservative voices aligned with the FBI, the CIA, and the US security state, as I have often explained, is not confined only to conservatives, but is really more of an issue of pro and anti-Western establishment. Because pro-establishment Republicans like Marco Rubio and Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham obviously would never be censored. They never have been. The conservative voices that get censored aren't mainstream establishment conservatives. They're anti-establishment or right-wing populists. And there are left-wing anti-establishment populists who are also being censored by big tech, and that has always been the case. In fact, the very first reporting that I ever did as a journalist on big tech's starting to censor the internet over political views was this September 2016 article, the title of which is, quote, "Facebook is collaborating with the Israeli government to determine who should be censored." And the article reported, quote, "The Associated Press reports today from Jerusalem that the Israeli government and Facebook have agreed to work together to determine how to tackle incitement on the social media network. These meetings are taking place as the government pushes ahead with legislative steps meant to force social networks to rein in content that Israel says incites violence." In other words, Israel is about to legislatively force Facebook to censor content deemed by Israeli officials to be improper, and Facebook appears eager to appease those threats by working directly with the Israeli government to determine what content should be censored. While the focus here is on Palestinians' quote incitement, it's actually very common for Israelis to use Facebook to urge violence against Palestinians, including settlers urging quote vengeance when there is an attack on Israel. Indeed, as the Washington Post recently noted, quote, "Palestinians have also taken issue with social media platforms saying they incite violence and foster an Israeli discourse of hatred, racism, and discriminatory attitudes against Palestinians." In 2014, thousands of Israelis used Facebook to post messages, quote, "calling for the murder of Palestinians." When an IDF occupying soldier was arrested for shooting and killing a wounded Palestinian point blank in the head last year, IDF soldiers used Facebook to praise the killing and justify that violence, with online Israeli mobs gathering in support. Indeed, Justice Minister Shakit herself, now part of the government team helping Facebook determine what to censor, has used Facebook to post astonishingly extremist and violent-inducing rhetoric against Palestinians. So I think what's so crucial here is that if you want to justify what the Israeli government is doing, namely giving lists of Palestinian activists and journalists to Facebook, where Facebook accepts in 95% of the cases the people that the Israeli government wants banned, if you want to justify that on the grounds that, look, that's different from the censorship that I'm opposed to, because those cases are people who are inciting violence. These are terrorists. First of all, you don't know that because you haven't seen the list of people the Israeli government once censored. And I hope that you can agree that the power to censor is dangerous, not just in the hands of the CIA and big tech, but also every government in the world, including Israel, that they will abuse that power by accusing their critics of, quote, inciting violence against them. Also note, number two, that is the standard justification that American liberals use for trying to censor conservatives. We don't censor conservatives. We just can censor people who are engaged in dangerous incitement of violence, people who advocate the replacement theory or white supremacy or transphobia that puts people in danger. It's the same exact rationale. And number three, if you really want to say that anyone who's cheering violence should be censored from the internet, and therefore the Israelis are correct to do this in conjunction with Facebook, then there, as I just showed you, there are Israelis who explicitly advocate for violence against Palestinians. The Israelis and Palestinians hate one another, and they have a very protracted conflict where violence is sometimes used. But you cannot say that when the left joins with Facebook or big tech to censor conservatives, they're acting tyrannically, and then turn around and justify big tech doing that to the people with whom you most disagree or the people whom you hate. You lose your credibility as a free speech activist to do that, and that's the reason why FIRE merits so much respect, because even though they started as a group protecting conservative students and professors from retaliation, they began to see that one of the major groups most censored on college campuses are critics of Israel and defenders of Palestinians who are where the censorship is justified by branding them anti-Semites. Now, I'm going to skip over a little bit more because this is more about how Facebook and Israel have been working together, and I want to take you to the fact that I know some of you think and believe that in the United States it's extremely common to criticize Israel, and that therefore people who are criticizing Israel are actually the hegemonic force, whereas very few people are willing to defend Israel. That is a persecution complex. That is factually false, demonstrably false. I don't really think it matters for the censorship debate, which we're having, whether more people in the United States support Israel or Palestine. I think censorship of either side is wrong, no matter how popular those views are. But the reality is that if you look at resolutions presented in the American Congress that weigh in whenever there's outbreaks of violence between Israel on the one hand and Palestinians on the other, in almost every country in the world, there is something like a 50-50 split. 50% of the people put more blame on Israel, 50% of the people put more blame on the Palestinians. Here in the United States, it's overwhelmingly a pro-Israel sentiment. And that is true in both political parties. And it has been for a very long time. It isn't the people defending Israel who are the marginalized group or the people who are taking the unpopular position. It's the people criticizing Israel who are. And that's the reason why they're so often targeted with censorship, because it is the marginalized group and the people with the marginalized views who are often targeted with censorship. And just to demonstrate to you how unified the Democratic Party is in support of Israel, and not just support of Israel, but the Israeli government and U.S. support for Israel, let's look at the new Democratic House leader, Hakeem Jeffries, who was elected by the entire House Democratic Caucus, including the squad, with no dissent, by acclamation. Here you see the Guardian article from about 3 weeks before he was about to be anointed to that position, and the headline is, Hakeem Jeffries' likely elevation set to please U.S.-Israel groups. And there's very good reason for that. Let's look at the article itself. Quote, the prospect of Hakeem Jeffries leading the Democrats in the House has been greeted with delight by hardline pro-Israel groups, increasingly alarmed at a growing dissent in Congress over Israeli treatment of the Palestinians, including large-scale forced removals of Arabs from their homes, which is only likely to intensify as the Israeli far-right gains power. The former Democratic Senator, Robert Wexler, a longtime AIPAC loyalist, told the journal Jewish Insider, quote, the pro-Israel camp needs someone just like Hakeem to lead us in the future. Quote, in fact, I would say, if the pro-Israel community wanted to create a Democratic leader for the future, we would create Hakeem Jeffries. In other words, you can't get better than Hakeem Jeffries when it comes to having a pro-Israel view in American politics. Quote, Hakeem is not just interested in these issues, he's devoted to them. He's respectful of the American Jewish community, he identifies with it, and he's just a really nice guy on top of it. Others who defend Israeli policies have praised Jeffrey in similarly lavish terms. The congressman has been just as effusive in speaking about Israel. In 2020, Jeffries told a conference of the U.S.'s largest and most powerful pro-Israel lobbying group, AIPAC, that, quote, back home in the New York City, we consider Jerusalem to be the sixth borough. He doesn't even consider Israel to be a foreign country. He considers Israel to be almost part of the United States, as he says himself. That's not a Republican, that's a Democrat, the leading Democrat, the Democrat chosen unanimously to lead the House Democrats. Now, here's why this matters so much. Here's a report on U.S. foreign aid to Israel from the Congressional Research Service, which I would say is one of the most trustworthy sources in the country still. It's one of the few authoritative sources that just reports facts. I'm not going to say they're completely free of political bias because nobody is, but they work very hard to be a reliable conveyor of facts. And they issue reports to members of Congress, to aid members of Congress in formulating policy views. And this is a report on U.S. foreign aid to Israel. And the article says, quote, Israel is the largest cumulative recipient of U.S. foreign assistance since World War II. Successive administrations, meaning Democrat and Republican, working with Congress, led by Democrats and Republicans, have provided Israel with significant assistance in light of robust U.S. domestic support for Israel and its security, shared strategic goals in the Middle East, a mutual commitment to democratic values, and historical ties dating from U.S. support for the creation of Israel in 1948. To date, the United States has provided Israel $150 billion in bilateral assistance and missile defense funding. At present, almost all of U.S. bilateral aid to Israel is in the form of military assistance. From 1971 to 2007, Israel also received significant economic assistance. In 2016, when Barack Obama was president, the U.S. and the Israeli government signed their third 10-year memorandum of understanding on military aid, covering fiscal year 2019 to fiscal year 2028, a 10-year agreement. Under the terms of that memorandum of understanding, the United States pledged to provide, subject to congressional appropriation, which is always, of course, coming, $38 billion in military aid, $33 billion in foreign military finance grants, plus $5 billion in missile defense appropriations to Israel. Now, some of that is money given to Israel to buy weapons from the U.S. arms industry. So in theory, it goes into the pockets of the shareholders of Raytheon and General Dynamics, if that excites you. But a lot of it is just enormous amounts of billions and billions of dollars by both parties being sent to the government of Israel. From the New York Times in 2016, on that memorandum of understanding that the Biden-Obama administration reported, quote, the United States has finalized a $38 billion package of military aid for Israel over the next 10 years, the largest of its kind ever, and the two allies plan to sign the agreement on Wednesday, American and Israeli officials said. The State Department scheduled a ceremony to formally announce the pact, which will be signed by Jacob Nagel, the acting national security advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu, and Thomas Shannon, the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. Susan Rice, President Obama's national security advisor, who handled the negotiations, plans to be on hand. The package represents a major commitment to Israel's security in the waning months of Mr. Obama's presidency, after years of fractious relations with Mr. Netanyahu over issues like the Iran nuclear agreement. Mr. Netanyahu agreed to several concessions to cement the deal rather than gamble on winning better terms from the next president. The package will provide an average of $3.8 billion a year over the next decade to Israel, already the largest recipient of American aid, including financing for missile defense systems that defend against rocket fired by groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. Under a previous 10-year agreement that expired in 2018, the United States provided about $3 billion a year, but lately Congress has added up to another $500 million a year for missile defense. Now, I know most people support U.S. aid to Israel. I still am going to have a show at some point on how this U.S. aid to Israel can be reconciled with the American first foreign policy defended by Donald Trump. Many of you may have forgotten that one of the things Donald Trump first said early on in his campaign that turned neocons against him was he said he thought that the United States was too one-sided in favor of Israel and should take a more neutral posture in order to facilitate a negotiated agreement between the two sides on the grounds that that conflict harms the United States because it is responsible for anti-American sentiment in the region. That was Donald Trump saying that. That was a major reason why neocons distrusted him from the beginning. He was eventually brought into line. He was one of the most pro-Israel presidents in history. But my point here is a lot of you probably support that. But you have to acknowledge that American citizens who are paying for that military aid have the absolute right to question whether that's a good policy, whether they want their taxpayer dollars going to Israel, just like Americans have the right to question whether they want their money going to fuel the war in Ukraine. And they have to be able to question that on the grounds that it's not good for the United States, and they don't agree with the actions of the Israeli government without being called anti-Semitic. And yet, I don't think it requires much to show you that that's exactly what happens to people who question that very consequential policy. A very similar dynamic to the one I described at the start of woke tactics of accusing people of bigotry, hidden bigotry, unexpressed bigotry, as a way of suppressing the ability and space to dissent on a particular policy seems to be prevailing here. Now, to conclude this examination, I want to show you what I would be willing to bet many of you have never heard, but which I regard as the single most brazen assault on the First Amendment in the last 10 years. More aggressive and more toxic than the Democrats' attempt to coerce big tech to censor on their behalf, which I regard as the First Amendment, more than other kinds of censorship scandals I've reported on. This is the most direct. And the only reason why it's not the most harmful is because it's so blatantly unconstitutional that every court that has thus far examined these laws, which have been enacted in, I believe, now 34 states, mostly red states, who have a big evangelical constituency, who are fanatical supporters of Israel, but also some blue states, including New York under Andrew Cuomo. This policy is so offensive to the First Amendment that to describe it, I think, demonstrated its unconstitutionality. Essentially, what these states have done is they have adopted a law that says the following. If you have a contract with the state, if, for example, you are a teacher who doesn't work full-time, but we contract your services on a part-time basis, or if you're a consultant who provides computer services to help state agencies function better, or any other contract that you might have with the state that has nothing to do with politics, you will lose your job and you will no longer be permitted to be considered for contracts with the state, even if you've worked for years in this capacity with perfect job evaluations, unless you're willing to sign a vow, a loyalty pledge, that you do not support the boycott of Israel, nor will you support the boycott of Israel through any actions that you will take. This is a law in 34 states that specifically says you can boycott other states in the country if you want, as often happens. Liberals boycotted Indiana and North Carolina over trans bathroom laws. That was fine. You can keep your job and with the state if you support boycotts of your fellow Americans. You can support the boycott of Georgia, which lost a major sporting event over what was alleged to have been their voter suppression laws that ended up seeing the greatest number of people voting in Georgia's elections since then. That's fine too. You can have your job with the state even if you support a boycott of your fellow citizens in Georgia. But what you can't do is participate in a boycott against the state of Israel. And it's not just that if we catch you doing it, we'll fire you. It's that you have to vow in advance that inside your brain you don't have any support for this boycott, nor will you ever. These are really what these laws say. And in 2018, I reported on one of the most amazing cases I've seen of a woman, an American citizen, who was fired from her job as being a speech pathologist for children. She works with children with speech disabilities who are developmentally disabled. And she lost her job because she refused to sign this loyalty oath. Quote, a children's speech pathologist who has worked for the last 9 years with developmentally disabled, autistic, and speech-impaired elementary school students in Austin, Texas, has been told that she can no longer work with the public school district after she refused to sign an oath vowing that she, quote, does not and, quote, will not engage in a boycott of Israel or, quote, otherwise take any action that is intended to inflict economic harm on that foreign nation. There was eventually a lawsuit filed, and at the time when I reported on this, I did not know, but she ultimately ended up winning. The court declared the Texas law signed by Greg Abbott unconstitutional. Quote, the child language specialist, Baya Amawi, is a U.S. citizen who received a master's degree in speech pathology in 1999, and since then has specialized in evaluations for young children with language difficulties. She was born in Austria and has lived in the U.S. for the last 30 years, fluently speaks 3 languages, English, German, and Arabic, and has 4 U.S.-born American children of her own. 4 U.S.-born American children. She began working in 2009 on a contract basis with this independent school district that includes Austin to provide assessments and support for school children from the country's growing Arabic speaking immigrant community. The children with whom she has worked span the age of 3 to 11. Ever since her work began for the school district in 2009, Her contract was renewed every year with no controversy or problem. But this year, all of that changed. On October 13th, they once again offered to extend her contract for another year by sending her the same contract as always, but this time she noticed that there was a loyalty oath required, which I'm going to put on the screen here, that required that she certify, in order to keep her job, quote, that one, she does not currently boycott Israel, and two, will not boycott Israel during the term of the contract. Now, in order for you to judge whether this is an egregious assault on the free speech rights of American citizens, and I don't understand how anyone could think it's anything but that, let me show you the video that we made of her just to introduce you to her and have you hear her story. Let's play that video.
I never thought I would be forefront for an issue or for a cause. I'm not a major activist, no. I'm not. I'm a busy mom of 4 kids. For me, it was like an opportunity for me to do something because my kids were watching me, first of all. And I always tell my kids, when you see something wrong, you have to fix it. I'm a speech-language pathologist. I have been contracting with Pflugerville Independent School District for about 9 years now. What was unique about my position was that I spoke Arabic, so we were able to correctly evaluate kids who came in with Arabic as a language. I love my job a lot. You know, I've always wanted to be in a job that was in the service field because I know I'm making a difference. This year, I got a new contract with new compliances, and I came across one that shocked me. The point of boycotting any products that supports Israel is to put pressure on the Israeli government to change its treatment, the inhumane treatment of the Palestinian people. Having grown up as a Palestinian, I know firsthand the oppression and the struggle that Palestinians face on a daily basis. You know, I have to set an example for my kids. We got to stand up for what's the justice and for right and equal opportunity for everybody and humane conditions. And so for me, it was an easy decision in that aspect. You know, I could not sign it. I was forced to depart from my job because I will not sign it, and I cannot return back if I don't sign it. I have been here in the States for over 30 years. I'm an American citizen. I follow the law, and so I have a luxury of having these rights, which many people in other countries do not have. It infringe on all my principles. And on top of that, my right to speech and also right to protest. It's baffling that they can throw this down our throats, you know, and decide to protect another country's economy versus protect our constitutional rights. I knew that I had to do something because I knew it's going to affect more than just me. It may affect also my kids. So I knew that something had to be done, and I couldn't just let it pass by.
Let me stress again, that is an American citizen, every bit as much as any of you who are American citizens, every bit as much as I am, with all the same rights under the Constitution, including the First Amendment. Do any of you believe that she should lose her job because of her political views, regardless of how much you disagree with those political views? Now, I know it's gospel among certain sectors to believe that people who boycott Israel are anti-Semitic and hate Jews, even though I saw no hatred in her over the hours that I interviewed her to do that reporting, none. Just like people who believe it's gospel on the left that if you want more police, you hate black people, or if you question whether puberty blockers should be given to 13-year-olds, you hate trans people. It's the same thing, just from different sides. But let me show you why. First of all, even if the boycott of Israel that she refuses to repudiate her support for is quote-unquote anti-Semitic, how does that justify her losing her job? Anti-Semitism is protected speech under the First Amendment, just like racism and xenophobia and misogyny, is transphobia and homophobia. But beyond that, this idea that anyone who supports a boycott of Israel as a means of putting pressure on Israel to change their policies, as she said, is her rationale. That anyone who supports that is automatically anti-Semitic makes no sense to me whatsoever. And I wanted to show you why to conclude. First of all, let's remember that most Americans look very fondly, as do most Westerners, back on the campaign in the 1980s to boycott the government of South Africa as a means of pressuring it to end its regime of apartheid. Boycotts are very commonly used in politics all the time as a way of trying to express political disagreement. In 2003, the lead singer of the Dixie Chicks performed a concert in Great Britain during the war in Iraq, and she stood up and made some very mild criticism of George Bush. She said, "I'm embarrassed to be an American, that George Bush is my president," because of the Iraq War, and millions of conservatives boycotted the Dixie Chicks, as they had every right to do, because they were expressing their displeasure with that group, and they wanted to deter other musicians from taking a similar position. But that is all independent of the censorship question of whether states can require people to take a loyalty oath to another country as a condition for keeping their job in the United States. And I put it that way because it is not only acceptable to boycott states within the United States, but many of the same people who want to ban the ability to boycott Israel are in favor of boycotting American states. Let me show you the most egregious example, just so I can close this show by illustrating this point of how extreme this has become. Here in March of 2017 was an article by CNBC about how much money it was going to cost the state of North Carolina as a result of their decision to enact a law banning trans women from using the female bathroom. I forget exactly what the law said, but it said something along the lines of the only people who are permitted to use bathrooms reserved for women are people who are biological women or who are born as biological women. The effect was to ban trans women from using female bathrooms. And it provoked enormous outrage among liberal America, to the point where everyone got together on the liberal side of politics, including sports leagues and corporations, and decided they were going to boycott this American state, not this foreign country, but this American state. Quote, "Despite Republican assurances that North Carolina's bathroom bill isn't hurting the economy, the law limiting LGBT protections," look at how they describe that, "the law limiting LGBT protections will cost that state more than $3.76 billion in lost business over a dozen years, according to an Associated Press analysis. Over the past year, North Carolina has suffered financial hits, ranging from scuttled plans for a PayPal facility that would have added to an estimated $2.6 billion to the state's economy, to a canceled Ringo Starr concert that deprived a town's amphitheater of about $33,000 in revenue. The blows have landed in the state's biggest cities, as well as the towns surrounding its flagship university, and from the mountains to the coast." Now, if you're somebody who agrees that the boycott of Israel is anti-Semitic and therefore should not be permitted, one of the people on your side is the former governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo. Here he is in 2016. This is a New York Times article announcing a new policy from of Andrew Cuomo, quote, "Cuomo to halt state business with groups that back the boycott of Israel." Here's the article, quote, "Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York ordered agencies under his control on Sunday to divest themselves of companies and organizations aligned with the Palestinian-backed boycott movement against Israel. Wading into a delicate international issue, Mr. Cuomo set executive branch and other state entities in opposition to the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions Movement, or BDS, which has grown in popularity in some quarters of the United States and elsewhere, alarming Jewish leaders who fear its toll on Israel's international image and economy. Mr. Cuomo made his announcement in a speech at the Harvard Club in Manhattan to an audience including local Jewish leaders and lawmakers, describing the BDS movement as, quote, an economic attack on Israel. Here's what Andrew Cuomo said, quote, "We cannot allow that to happen. If you boycott against Israel, New York will boycott you." So Andrew Cuomo, in that announcement, was saying, I hate boycotts. Boycotts are evil. They're an attack on this foreign country, and they're not allowed. If you boycott Israel, New York will boycott you. That's how much contempt he had for the boycott of this foreign country. But when it comes to boycotts of his fellow American citizens, people of his own country, boycotts are completely fine with him. In fact, they're not fine, they're moral imperatives. Here from NPR is an article announcing another Andrew Cuomo policy. Quote, New York restricts public employees' travel to North Carolina over the LGBT bill. In other words, that boycott of North Carolina that I just showed you that had harmed the people and business and economy of North Carolina, that was a, quote, economic attack on North Carolina, to use Andrew Cuomo's words, is one that Andrew Cuomo not only approved of, but engaged in. Quote, New York State has joined the cities of Seattle, San Francisco, and New York in restricting non-essential public employee travel to North Carolina. The moves are in response to a newly passed North Carolina law that critics say is discriminatory to the LGBT community. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's executive order bans, quote, all taxpayer-funded trips to North Carolina unless they're essential to public health or law enforcement. NPR's Hansi Lo Wang tells our newscast unit, quote, from Stonewall to marriage equality, our state has been a beacon of hope and equality for the LGBT community, and we will not stand idly by as misguided legislation replicates the discrimination of the past, Cuomo said in a statement. As long as there is a law in North Carolina that creates the grounds for discrimination against LGBT people, I am barring non-essential travel to the state. So if you support a boycott of a foreign country, you're off limits and radioactive to have a job with New York. But if you want to boycott your fellow Americans over a law that has a lot of popular support regarding trans women in bathrooms, you will be boycotted by New York. North Carolina is not the only state that Andrew Cuomo boycotted. Here from Politico in 2015, you see the headline there, Cuomo bans non-essential state-funded travel to Indiana. Yet another state that Andrew Cuomo decided to boycott. Quote, Governor Andrew Cuomo on Tuesday ordered a ban on non-essential state-funded travel to Indiana in protest of a, quote, religious freedom law signed by that state's governor, Mike Pence, last week that was viewed as discriminatory to the LGBT community. Quote, today I direct all agencies, departments, boards, and commissions to immediately review all requests for state-funded or state-sponsored travel to the state of Indiana and to bar any such publicly funded travel that is not essential to the enforcement of state law or public health and safety, Cuomo said in a release. Quote, the ban on publicly funded travel shall take effect immediately. New York State has always been and will continue to be a leader in ensuring that all LGBT persons enjoy full and equal civil rights. With this action, we stand by our LGBT family members, friends, and colleagues to ensure that their rights are respected. Now, what does it tell you about the climate of the United States where people who boycott the state of Israel for reasons you may or may not disagree with, but have legitimate policy aims, which is to pressure the Israeli government to withdraw from the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, an occupation which, again, you might agree with, but is regarded as illegal by states all over the world, including the UN. I'm not saying it's a view you have to believe. I'm just saying it's a legitimate political project to believe it. Millions and millions and millions of people around the planet do. She's exercising her First Amendment rights as free speech rights as an American citizen to participate in that boycott, as millions of people are, but they're getting fired for it or kicked off faculty for it or being banned from having student groups because of it. A clear abridgment of our freedom to debate openly a very consequential policy, which is U.S. support for this foreign country, while at the same time, many of the very same people who demonize you as an anti-Semite for boycotting a foreign country will actually call you a bigot if you don't boycott your fellow citizens in American states. This is the climate that I'm becoming very concerned about, because it is contaminating every institution of authority. And in order to do it, it is using tactics that in every other instance are recognized as tawdry and toxic and irresponsible, namely casually accusing people with whom you disagree on political debates of being bigoted. And to me, it is no more noble or justified to call people who disagree with you on police reform anti-racist, or call people who disagree with you on Me Too excesses misogynist, or the issue of trans treatment for kids transphobic. It's no more benevolent or noble than to call people who question the actions of a foreign government or are activists in order to put pressure on the government to stop anti-Semites. They both use the same tactic. They both spring from the same mentality. And ultimately, it's now finding its way into the law. The idea that this view is not only to be socially scorned, but legally banned and legally punished and legally prohibited. All right, so that concludes our show for this evening. As I said, that is a sensitive topic. I knew it was. We wanted to make sure to treat it with the comprehensive and responsible scrutiny that we think it deserves. Therefore, we went a little over our time, which is one of the luxuries of being on this platform instead of on television, where your time ends exactly at the moment. We do try and generally respect the time constraints of our show, but we will go over when we think it's necessary, when a topic deserves a lot of scrutiny, as we believe this one did, to do responsibly. As always, we will now move to Locals, which is the interactive community-based platform on Rumble, which allows us to take your questions, your comments, which I'm sure there'll be a lot of, to hear your feedback, and to generally be interactive. Those who want to participate can join our Locals community by clicking the join button that's in red on the lower part of the screen, right under the Rumble video. For those who aren't a part of that or don't, we hope to see you back here tomorrow night and every night at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively here on Rumble, the free speech alternative to YouTube. Have a great night.